Hello everyone! Today, I'm bringing you a new video in the story of Hoai Ca and Hùng. This episode doesn't come with dramatic twists or breathless climaxes. Instead, it carries a quiet kind of happiness, woven together with an unexpected moment that allows emotions to slowly unfold, gentle, restrained, yet deeply touching. That afternoon, Hoai Ca's small house felt unusually quiet. Not the kind of peaceful silence that brings comfort, but the kind that makes every tiny sound stand out. The ticking of the wall clock echoed steadily, 1 second at a time, as if time itself were being stretched longer than usual. The last rays of sunlight streamed through the window, casting thin strips of light across the floor, frozen and unmoving. Tony was sitting in his room, colorful puzzle pieces spread out in front of him. He leaned close to the floor, his small hands carefully fitting each piece together. His face was intensely focused, occasionally tilting his head as if deciding where the next piece should go. The entire house seemed to hold its breath, with life existing only in that room, where the soft clink of toys touching each other could barely be heard. Meanwhile, in the bathroom, Hoai Ca stood completely still. The narrow space made the air feel even heavier, almost suffocating. Her trembling hand held the pregnancy test, fingers gripping it so tightly they had turned pale. She didn't quite dare to look straight at it, yet she couldn't look away either. When the 2 red lines appeared clearly before her eyes, time seemed to stop. Hoai Ca froze. Her heart pounded so hard that every beat echoed loudly in her chest. Her breathing became rapid, as if one slightly deeper breath might shatter the moment. Joy flashed through her for just an instant, only to be immediately swallowed by anxiety. She hadn't even had time to smile before she felt her throat tighten. A flood of thoughts rushed through her mind. She thought of Tony, the little boy sitting outside, still far too young to understand the changes adults go through. She thought of Hùng, the man who had always been by her side, quiet but steady. And then she thought of the future, a future she hadn't yet dared to fully imagine, unsure whether she was strong enough to step forward into it. Hoai Ca placed a hand on her belly, her palm resting lightly there in an instinctive gesture. Her voice trembled as she whispered, so softly it was almost meant only for herself. "If this is real, what am I supposed to do?" The bathroom door suddenly opened. Hùng stood there. His eyes immediately settled on Hoai Ca's pale face, on her motionless posture, as if all her strength had drained away. In that instant, he sensed something was wrong, a sharp, undeniable feeling of unease. "What's wrong? Is something happening?" His voice was low, filled with concern. Hoai Ca didn't answer right away. Her throat felt tight, her words stuck. Slowly, she held out the pregnancy test toward him, her hand still trembling slightly. Hùng lowered his gaze. It was only a brief moment, but enough to make a man who had faced countless intense cases and life-or-death situations stop short. The 2 red lines appeared clearly before his eyes, bold, unmistakable, impossible to deny. 2 lines. His voice dropped even lower than usual. Not out of fear, but because the emotions rising inside him were too sudden, too overwhelming. Hoai Ca nodded softly. Her eyes were red, her lashes quivering as she tried to hold back tears. She looked at Hùng with a gaze filled with both hope and worry. She wasn't waiting for grand promises or beautiful words. What she wanted, what she needed, was simply his genuine reaction. Hùng stepped forward. He took her hand, his large, warm palm enclosing her cold, tense fingers. The grip wasn't tight, but it was firm, steady, reassuring, like a promise that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "I'm here," he said. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Just those 2 short sentences were enough to break through the final wall around Hoai Ca's heart. She could no longer hold back her tears. They fell quietly, carrying with them all her worries, fears, and the fragile happiness that was slowly beginning to take shape. That evening, Hoai Ca's bedroom was bathed in a soft yellow glow. The space was quiet, filled only with the steady hum of the fan and the gentle breathing of mother and child. Hoai Ca sat leaning against the headboard, her back slightly sore, both hands resting loosely on her belly. Tony sat close beside her, hugging the familiar teddy bear whose fur had worn thin over the years. He rested his head against his mother's shoulder, silent as always. He didn't speak or ask questions, only occasionally rubbing his cheek lightly against Hoai Ca's arm, a habit he had kept since he was very small, whenever he needed a sense of safety. Hung stood at the doorway, not stepping inside right away. He leaned against the doorframe, quietly observing. His gaze followed every small movement between the two, from the way Tony leaned closer to Hoai Ca, to the gentle motion of her hand stroking her son's hair. In that moment, Hung said nothing. He simply stood there, allowing the room to hold on to its own private warmth. Hoai Ca lowered her head to look at her son, her hand softly smoothing Tony's hair. Her voice was gentler than usual, slow and careful, as if speaking even a little faster might shatter the fragile calm. "Tony, if our family were to have another baby..." Before she could finish the sentence, Tony slowly lifted his head. He looked at his mother, his eyes clear yet deeply focused. Then his gaze drifted downward, coming to rest on Hoai Ca's belly, slightly rounded beneath the thin fabric of her sleepwear. Tony didn't ask anything. He didn't look surprised. He simply reached out, slowly, and placed his hand on his mother's belly. His small palm rested there, very lightly, very carefully, as if even the slightest pressure might hurt something precious. That single gesture made Hoai Ca's throat tighten. She couldn't say another word. She only squeezed her son's hand gently, her eyes burning. There are moments that need no explanation, moments when a small action alone is enough to soften an adult's heart. Hung stepped forward. He didn't remain standing, but knelt down in front of Tony, lowering himself to the boy's eye level. He placed his own hand over Tony's, the one resting on Hoai Ca's belly. The touch was light but steady. Hung gave a slight nod, his eyes deepening like a quiet, unspoken confirmation. Tony didn't respond with words. He only hugged his teddy bear a little tighter, then leaned closer against his mother. His eyes stayed fixed on Hoai Ca's belly for a long time, never looking away. There was no fear, no resistance, only a silent observation, innocent and clumsy, yet utterly sincere. Hoai Ca understood. Some kinds of love don't need to be spoken. They exist in silence, in the way a head leans in a small hand resting on a mother's belly, in a gaze that refuses to look away. Time passed, day by day, slow yet steady. Hoai Ca's belly gradually grew, the presence of the little life inside becoming more and more real. The small house changed along with it, not in loud or disruptive ways, but through the addition of gentle, almost unnoticed habits. Every evening, when Hoai Ca lay down to rest, Tony would quietly bring his pillow and place it beside her bed. He never climbed onto the bed, he simply sat next to it. Tony pressed his ear against Hoai Ca's belly, listening intently, as if trying to catch something very important. Sometimes he smiled to himself, a brief, fleeting smile, before returning to his usual silence. One day, Tony brought a glass of milk and carefully set it on the table. He then turned and gently tugged at Hung's hand, soft but insistent, before pointing toward Hoai Ca's belly, signaling for him to sit closer. No words. No further gestures needed. Hung looked at Tony, his expression softening. He gently ruffled the boy's hair, his hand lingering longer than usual, as if wanting to hold on to that moment. He understood, very clearly, that Tony was protecting his sibling in his own way, quietly, awkwardly, but with all his heart. The small house slowly grew accustomed to these unspoken forms of love. No one said anything, yet everyone could feel it day by day, night by night. When Hoai Ca entered her 38th week of pregnancy, the tension in Hung became impossible to miss. He didn't express it with words, it showed in the smallest details of his actions. The hospital bag had been prepared early, neatly placed near the front door, always in the most visible spot. Every item inside was checked again and again, even though Hoai Ca kept telling him there was still time. His phone was almost never out of his hand, the battery always fully charged, the volume always turned up high, as if he were afraid of missing even the slightest call or signal. At night, Hung slept very lightly. The smallest movement, Hoai Ca turning over, shifting slightly, or breathing a bit heavier, was enough to wake him instantly. There were moments when he would sit up abruptly, turning to look at her for a long time, only lying back down slowly once he was sure she was fine. His worry wasn't loud or dramatic, but it lingered constantly, clinging to him hour after hour. Hoai Ca noticed it early on. Seeing how tense Hung had become made her feel both touched and quietly amused. One evening, when she saw him checking the bag yet again, she smiled softly and said in a gentle tone, "You're acting like I'm going to give birth right this second." Her smile wasn't teasing, it was more like an attempt to soothe his anxiety. But Hung didn't smile back. He only turned to look at her, his expression serious, then reached out and held her hand, saying nothing more. Time continued to pass slowly, yet relentlessly. Hoai Ca's belly grew larger by the day, and every step she took had to be a little more careful. Evenings in the small house gradually became something special. Whenever Hoai Ca lay down to rest, Tony was almost always the first to appear. Quietly, he would bring his pillow and place it beside his mother's bed, then sit down next to her, so familiar with the routine that no one needed to remind him. Tony pressed his ear against his mother's belly, listening intently. Sometimes he closed his eyes, as if trying to sense something from within. Sometimes the corner of his mouth curved into a very faint smile, only to disappear quickly as he returned to his usual serious expression. He didn't say a word, he simply repeated the same action every night, steady and unwavering, like an indispensable ritual. One day, Tony brought a glass of milk and carefully placed it on the table. He then turned and grabbed Hung's hand, his grip firm and urgent, before pointing toward Hoai Ca's belly, signaling for him to sit closer to her. No explanation. No sound at all. Yet Tony's eyes were clear enough for Hung to understand. Hung looked at the boy, a strange, indescribable emotion rising in his chest. He gently patted Tony's head, his hand lingering longer than usual. Without words, he understood that Tony was protecting his sibling in his own way, quietly, awkwardly, yet with a sincerity so deep it made even adults pause. The small house slowly grew accustomed to that kind of love. No one spoke about it, but everyone could feel the bond strengthening day by day, silent and enduring. Until one unexpected moment. When Hoai Ca suddenly clutched her belly as a sharp pain struck, Tony was standing nearby. He froze for a split second, then rushed over in panic, clinging tightly to his mother's hand. His small fingers squeezed Hoai Ca's hand with all his strength, as if letting go for even a moment might make her disappear. Unable to speak, Tony looked up at Hung with pleading eyes, then tugged hard on his hand, pulling him toward Hoai Ca. No further signs were needed. Hung understood immediately. He moved at once, supporting Hoai Ca, one arm firmly around her back. Turning to Tony, his voice dropped low as he tried to stay calm. "Tony, be good and stay here, okay? Dad will take Mom." Tony didn't cry. He stood perfectly still, gripping his worn teddy bear so tightly his fingers turned white. His eyes followed every step his mother took, never looking away even for a second. That silence wasn't because he wasn't afraid, it was because he was trying, in his own way, to stay strong. Hoai Ca turned back to look at her son, her eyes filling with tears, yet she still forced a reassuring smile. Hung tightened his grip on her hand, as if trying to give her more strength. She smiled softly, half comforting, half soothing. "Why are you so tense?" Hung didn't smile. He only held her hand tighter, his voice low and steady. "I just don't want to miss anything." The words settled quietly into the air, between Hoai Ca's labored breathing and Tony's unwavering gaze, like a quiet signal that a very important moment was drawing closer and closer. The ambulance came to a stop in front of the hospital gates under the cold white lights. The sharp screech of the brakes rang out briefly, then faded, leaving behind a suffocating, tense silence. The doors swung open, and the medical staff moved in quickly. Hoai Ca was transferred onto a gurney, her body instinctively curling as another wave of pain crashed over her, one surge after another, relentless, giving her no time to prepare. Her hand clutched tightly onto Hung's. The grip was uneven, sometimes strong, sometimes trembling, but more than enough for him to feel exactly how much she was enduring. Hoai Ca's breathing grew rapid, sweat beading across her forehead, her lips pressed together as she fought to hold back a groan. Hung bent down low, leaning close to her ear, his voice deep and slow, every word spoken clearly. "Look at me. You don't have to be afraid." Hoai Ca's eyes searched for his. In that brief moment, amid the bright hospital corridor and hurried footsteps, she saw only Hung's familiar face. The pain didn't disappear, but his presence gave her something to cling to, a single anchor to endure what was coming. The delivery room doors opened. Inside was brighter, colder, the sharp scent of disinfectant filling the air. The nurses quickly pushed the gurney inside, their movements firm yet gentle. Hung followed a few steps by instinct, wanting to go with her, but he stopped right at the threshold. An invisible yet unmistakable boundary held him back. He held Hoai Ca's hand tightly one last time. The grip lingered longer than usual, as if he were trying to pass on everything he hadn't had time to say. Hung leaned down, his voice low but steady. "I'm right here." Hoai Ca nodded faintly. She no longer had the strength to answer, only squeezed his hand once more, a silent reply. The delivery room doors closed. The sound of the doors shutting was soft, yet to Hung it felt as heavy as a bolt locking into place. He stood motionless outside as the red light above the door flicked on, casting a glow down the hallway, a color that carried both warning and hope. Hung let his hands fall, then clenched them together tightly. For the first time in his life, he felt two opposing emotions coexist so clearly, suffocating worry and a hope so fragile he dared not think too far ahead. Footsteps, rolling carts, the quiet voices of nurses echoed around him, but Hung barely heard a thing. Every sense he had was focused on that door. As the gurney was pushed deeper inside, Hung instinctively turned his head. At the far end of the hallway stood Tony. The boy's small figure looked even smaller in the wide, brightly lit hospital corridor. He didn't run over. He didn't cry. Tony simply stood there, feet pressed together, his worn teddy bear held tightly against his chest. When he saw Hung turn around, he raised his hand and waved, very gently, slowly, as if afraid of disturbing anyone. Then Tony placed his hand over his chest, the familiar gesture he used whenever he wanted to say love. That image slipped perfectly into Hoai Ca's view through the narrowing gap of the closing door. She saw it clearly. That small hand, the clumsy but sincere motion. Silent tears rolled onto her pillow, soaking into the white fabric. Not from pain, but from an emotion that swelled too full to contain. The delivery room doors closed completely. Hùng turned back to face them. The red light was still on. He stood there without moving, as if remaining in that exact spot meant he was still close to Hoai Ca. In his mind now was not only concern for the woman beyond the door, but also the vivid image of the little boy moments earlier, the first brother, standing quietly in a hospital hallway, loving his sibling with all the silent strength of his heart. The delivery room door closed under the cold white lights. Hùng stood motionless outside, his hands clenched so tightly they trembled. In one corner of the hallway, Tony hugged his teddy bear close, his clear eyes never leaving the door that had just shut. No one said a word. Only the pounding of anxious heartbeats, the hurried footsteps of nurses, and a tiny life preparing to enter this world. Will Hoai Ca make it through this challenging delivery? How will Hùng face the moment he truly becomes a father? And Tony, the quiet little boy, how will he welcome his new sibling? All the emotions waiting to burst will be revealed in the next episode. Don't forget to follow and subscribe so you won't miss this heartfelt journey of a small, loving family.
Hello, xin chào tất cả mọi người đã quay trở lại với kênh của mình. Lưng quá. Bây giờ thì mình đang làm gì đây? Một cái hiệu ứng. Ok rồi. Bây giờ mình sẽ làm ảnh thum nha. Làm ảnh thum xong thì mình sẽ like video này. Tạm biệt mọi người, hẹn gặp lại mọi người ở video sau.